Welcome everyone. This is Padmaja Sarathy, and we have the webinar, the standards-based IEPs. How do we develop that? Aligning instruction, IEPs, and alternate assessment. Today's focus would be on functional IEP objectives. The last webinar, webinar 1, we focused on the academic content areas and linking that with alternate assessment. And today's webinar, which is focusing on functional IEP objectives, will not necessarily be linking with the alternate assessment, but I'm going to be continuing with the math part of the IEP writing, and it is possible to link that math with functional, which will make it even more attractive for the students who are learning and for the teachers who are teaching. So it will have a functional element to the math objective, and I will also address communication, social and behavioral, and daily living skills in terms of developing IEP objectives that are measurable, that are data-based, and that will also lead to more independent functioning on the part of the student. So what are some things we are going to be looking at? How do we design and also deliver that instruction that is linked to IEP, but at the same time focuses on the needs of students with significant disabilities? How do we make sure we provide the necessary scaffolds and supports, the structure and the adaptations that is matched to individual student needs, and at the same time blend in both academic and functional to advance the student? And the focus heavily is going to be on how do we make every student as independent as possible? How do we focus on that self-management? How do we focus on that self-dependency? And I will also try to weave in some student scenarios so that it will enable better understanding of what I'm talking about, and examples of visual, tactile, and technology tools will also be integrated into that. And ultimately what we are looking for, how do we promote active learner engagement? What are some multiple ways that we draw that student in, and we also make sure the student has an opportunity to respond, and how do we provide different ways for that student to respond and achieve meaningful functional outcomes? On this slide, you will see the books that I have written. Another book, one of the books, which is a parent guide actually for the early childhood area, early intervention to preschool to kindergarten. It will be coming out most probably sometime in December, and it's a practical parent guide focusing on the law as well as what are some things the parent can do at an IEP meeting and also in working with the school district. And today's webinar is derived, let's say, from two of the books that I have written. One is Serving Students with Severe and Multiple Disabilities, and the other one is Students with Significant Disabilities. The first one gives you a variety of scenarios of students with multiple and some with profound disabilities and communication difficulties. The second one focuses heavily on that, but it provides kind of an instructional organizers and learning frameworks, and how do we connect alternate assessment with the actual teaching in the classroom, and how do we develop those IEPs, standards-based IEPs and all that. Okay. One of the first steps, of course, is, as I explained last time, this is just a quick review, is to make sure that we connect with the standards. And of course, that's much more applicable in terms of academic IEP objectives. As for us, today's webinar, one of the most important things I want to emphasize is to know the student well. What are the strengths? What are the needs? And how do we make sure we connect with those needs and those strengths and then pull those strengths and address the needs? And then how do we understand clearly the present level of performance? And I would like to, at this time, something that I wrote down that I'm going to share with you. Okay, and let's say the teacher wants the student to figure out. The student is asked to pass out some, let's say, snacks or index cards. And the teacher, this is a math kind of monitoring or determining the present level of performance. And the teacher says, we have 6 students in the classroom. Each student needs 4 index cards or 4 crackers. What you need to find out is how many crackers, if I give you, how many crackers you would need. But for that, the teacher gives, let's say, 25 crackers or 25 index cards, and then the teacher asks the student to pass it out to 6. Each one gets 4. Then you try to determine if the student is actually doing the math in terms of addition, or is the student advanced enough to do multiplication. Let's say the student passes out 4 crackers, he knows how to count, he knows how to form a set of 4, and then gives 4 to each student, and then kind of is not able to figure out in his head that 6 times 4 is 24, and that 1 will be left over, but he passes out 4 per person and then tells the teacher, oh, I have 1 left. So you try to determine, is the student at the addition level or is the student at the multiplication level? So that kind of evaluation, monitoring, data gathering will help in determining the present level of performance. And the same thing you can do in terms of reading where the student is. So based on that, you make sure you have IEP, you write IEPs that are measurable, that are observable, and that's data-based, and that's age-appropriate and generalizable. I want to mention about age-appropriate here. If at the high school level, we are asking a student at the high school level to write his name and then trace his name with the teacher holding his hand and moving the hand forward as the student traces his name, that is really not age appropriate. It is much better for that student to be able to pick up his name stamp and to stamp his name. That's a much more age-appropriate activity. So it is important to remember it is not going to be possible for him to generalize his writing his name with somebody holding his hand and moving his hand to trace his name in all settings. So it is much better, even if he has to use a stamp in different settings, that's much more plausible solution. And then it is important what kind of specialized instruction and accommodations and supports the student needs to reach the goals. And I will go through this as we go through the different slides. And then it is important to know how do we measure. And at the end of this webinar, I do have a slide that shows how do we measure the progress, monitoring the progress, and a slide that shows you how you can chart that. So the most important thing is individualized element of the IEP focusing on the student. So some IEP objectives are not going to connect with any standards because they may be focusing on the eating skills, toileting, appropriate positioning, and so that is also added to your IEP objectives. And then we also need to address communication, social goals and objectives and behavior goals, and that can be done also during academic instruction. There will not always be an IEP match with the curriculum standards. Okay, now let's look at some guidelines. some students need intensive instructional support. So let's look at a student with significant motor needs, and the student, let's say, is presently using a weighted spoon, and at the same time a weighted fork for eating. And let's say the student, she uses an adapted bowl with a lip that assists her when she is scooping the food and taking it to her mouth. She eats, of course, with some moderate amount of spillage does occur, but she is reminded while she is eating to make sure that she eats with smaller bites, and she also is encouraged to use a plastic apron so that it doesn't ruin her clothes. And then she is encouraged to put down her fork or spoon between bites, and the OT is involved and actively providing and making sure, providing the consulting service regularly so that she can continue and improve in her eating as independently as possible. So, and this should happen in all settings. And this information should be shared, for example, with the family. So this may be a situation where you need intensive instructional support for that student. And the other important thing is we have to consider the student's level of communication. What is the symbolic level of communication? What is the cognitive functioning of that student? Is the student functioning at the pre-symbolic level? That means the student has not yet acquired an understanding of words or written symbols or even kind of pictures, and most of the time we tend to use these line drawings which are not really all that clear to a student. So these are students who would benefit from concrete objects and concrete representations and maybe gradually moving to photographs. Then you have some students who are functioning at the early symbolic level. They can relate to words, but they need the words enhanced, paired with photographs, pictures, and maybe some amount of gradually introducing line drawings, and that's your board maker that most people use, the line drawing. And then you have some students who are functioning at the expanded symbolic level. They have acquired basic academic skills. They may have sight words, like that student example that I mentioned, who is able to do math operation of addition, but not yet the multiplication. So this student functioning at the expanded symbolic level has letter and number recognition and maybe some amount of money skills, and you want to tailor your instructional support based on the student's level of communication. And based on the communication, based on the cognitive function, based on the motor functioning of the student, we can vary how the student responds. So the student response mode may vary and consider different kinds of options. One of the things that I frequently observe, which causes me considerable concern, is that when the student is not able to respond to the way we expect that student to respond, most of the time verbally, we tend to provide over-intensive prompting. Either we hold the student's hand and move the hand to the right answer, or in some cases when we ask the student to count, we close the hand as soon as the student has counted the specified number of objects. without realizing that the student really does not have one-to-one correspondence. And sometimes what we do is we do not provide sufficient wait time for the student to respond, okay, and then we respond for the student, or we say the answer and the student repeats the answer and we follow it up with saying, oh, good job. So the student thinks the next time that he has to wait for the teacher or the paraeducator who is working with him, and the paraeducator will say the word, he will repeat it, and he will get complimented for that. So these are all things we need to be aware of when we are looking at the student response. Is the student able to verbally respond to question? Or is the student able to verbally respond looking at an array of answer which provides him with the cue? Is the student able to point to the correct response, not able to verbally respond, but given an array of choices? Is the student able to make a selection, pulling the correct response from an array of choices? And again, in terms of the array of choices, you may want to give, let's say, the ideal number is maybe 4 with 1 correct response, 1 plausible response, and 2 incorrect responses that are totally unrelated to the question. And in some cases, the student may be able to generate the response typing the answer on the computer. And in some cases, where the student is not able to pull out or point or verbally respond, you may want to use an eye gaze board where the pictures are placed on either end. This is usually a see-through glass, plexiglass, and by looking through the plexiglass, the teacher can see where the student focuses his or her eyes to indicate the response to the question, the answer. So that's another option that can be used. And we need to make sure that the response mode, once the student learns the material, needs to be something that the student can do as independently as possible. The one thing I do want to emphasize is independent performance is the ultimate goal. And we have to ask ourselves the question, where do we want to see the student at the end of the year, at the end of 3 years, at the end of 5 years? So we have to kind of begin with the end in mind, that we want to prepare the student to be as independent as possible, and so that we can improve his quality of life. And that's extremely important when we are serving students with significant cognitive and communication disabilities. How can we broaden his or her world? How can you build a positive perception about that student, about the learner in the eyes of others, so that they don't engage in some kind of a pity to kind of want to come and help? So if you see a student who uses a name stamp independently, then your perception is different from than when a paraeducator or a teacher holds the student's hand and traces his name. So that is important to remember. So we have to ask what objective, what activities will help the student to gain self-dependence and control over his environment, over his activities, and the different settings. So I kind of almost spoke ahead of this slide. So our goal is aiming for independent student performance. So the objectives must address the student to perform independently. Let's look at the goal. The goal is the student will appropriately respond who, when, where questioned using a communication device, let's say for 80% of opportunities over a 9-week period. So how do we take the student towards that goal? So when the student is asked a question, he will look at the speaker, assuming the student has visual abilities, visual skills, The student will look at the speaker and he will point to the appropriate picture. It could be a concrete representation, depending on his level of communication, the symbolic level of communication, and he will use his communication device within a certain period of time, within 5 seconds, for 8 out of 10 consecutive opportunities during the first 3-week period, and you keep going on for the next 3 weeks and the next 3 weeks, and assuming the student has succeeded in this first 3 weeks. So we have a participant poll here. Chris will make appropriate choices at appropriate times using a communication device. Between the last webinar and this webinar, you may get an idea as to what is measurable and specific and data-based. So is it a clearly stated measurable goal? No. Or is the goal stated vaguely? Okay, I'll wait for the responses to come in. They're still coming in. Okay, I'm going to skip to results. Majority of you feel it's vaguely stated, and a couple of you feel it's correctly. I can understand why you may think you have to make appropriate choices, but that is a vague term, because when you say appropriate times, you have to more or less specify those times when the student will make that appropriate choice. So you need far clearer expression of that statement so that anybody, if the student moves to another school district, another state, that person should be able to take that IEP goal and say, these are all the settings. Is it in the cafeteria? Is it in the playground? Is it in when he goes to the gym? Is the student given a choice, can he make? And what kind of choices should be more specific? Let's say there are a couple of more statements here, objective. So one of the first things I do want to say, when you're working on a communication objective, it is important to work closely with a speech pathologist and any other support staff, maybe an assistive technology specialist, so that we can pair that assistive technology device with the communication objective so that it's a kind of a using a wholesome approach. Let's look at this objective. While positioned in the seating device, let's say during the morning meeting, student will activate a switch and participate vocally with peers. He doesn't have to say his name, but kind of indicate his presence or her presence within 10 seconds of a request for 8 out of 10 consecutive. So this is a very clearly stated how many opportunities are provided, how much wait time you provide for the student to respond, and how does he. He doesn't say he has to say his name, but he does respond, make a kind of vocal response, but he is aided with a communication device. He is activating it within a certain time. And let us say another objective, that was about the morning meeting. Given opportunities to share information on the topic of discussion, let's say during morning meeting, following the attendance or following presence, indicating presence, science, it could be social studies, news item. Student will, many teachers are using unique learning news news to use, so it could be in that context. Student B will communicate using 2-word phrases. This is a student who can use verbal responses. during a 4 out of 5 opportunities over a 3-week period as observed and recorded by the staff. And as I have stated, the student is not at the pre-symbolic level like the previous student, but this student is at the early symbolic level. I do want to go back to that pre-symbolic level, that student who is making a vocal response with the aid of a communication device. In one of the classrooms many, many years ago that I taught, that I would like to share with you, maybe some of you are already doing it, I found was wonderful was that the teacher had, I think, 6 or 7 students, and she put that photograph of each student as a part of the PowerPoint presentation. So at every morning at the beginning, to indicate presence, she will put that PowerPoint show that will show the picture of the student, and the student will recognize this picture, and then he will hit that assistive technology device if the student is not able to communicate verbally, yes, I am here. So that is another way that you can connect the student with his picture and also to recognize his picture and to be able to respond. That gives such a great sense of thrill and fulfillment to the student. So what kind of supports can be provided for students with significant needs who have behavioral and communication needs? Certainly picture supports, and one of the things that I would like to mention here is to use photographs, and these days photographs have become very simple, and this idea that I just shared with you about a PowerPoint presentation showing all the students in the classroom right at the beginning where the students indicate their presence was such a great idea. The other thing that you can use is to silently cue the student to the behavior you want to see. I have shared this with during my other webinars, like a behavior cue cards, like whether you want the student to be quiet or you want the student to keep the student hands away from another student, or you want the student to be looking at the teacher, if you want the student to be hearing, listening. Those are all behavior cue cards you can use as silent cues to the student. And the other thing that you can think of in terms of behavior cue is calming cards, to kind of show the calming card what the student needs to do, and maybe sometimes use a break card for the student to take a break and then come back. Certainly concrete objects and manipulatives are very, very helpful for students who are functioning at the pre-symbolic level. And I cannot overemphasize the use of assistive technology to give a voice to the student. The only thing that I would like to mention here is sometimes we begin with a device that has far too many icons, so it may be sometimes helpful to use something simple like an eye-tactile communicator, whether they are making choice between 2 things. And answer choices, which is a choice board with 3 choices or 4 choices, just with a laminated sheet, and social narratives, which are social skill stories and kind of computer software and apps that you can use. And definitely for your higher functioning, expanded symbolic level student, you can use self-monitoring charts and tools that is posted right on their desk to kind of remind them, and you can just walk by and point and gesture towards that. These are all supports that we can build in as part of our structure. So this is kind of, for example, a response participation. Sometimes when you don't want the student to shout out or take other people's time, so everybody gets a chance to provide that answer of yes or no to a question. Sometimes it's a good idea at the beginning of the lesson to get the student energized, to ask some very simple questions that require yes or no answers and build that motivation level of the student. So now, going to math and connecting math with some functional. This is math with art, which will increase the motivation level. So they are finding the attributes of different shapes, and we are connecting it with art. Let's say you present the student with 3 to 5 or maybe more geometric shapes which are pre-cut, and then you ask the student to use as many shapes as possible, or you specify a number, like you have to use 3 shapes to make a design. And then you ask about the shapes that they have used. And when the teacher describes a shape, and they can use a yes/no card to say whether they have that shape. And you describe the shape, it's like saying a triangle has 3 sides, a square has 4 sides, and all the sides are the same. A rectangle has 4 sides with 2 sides that are long and the 2 sides are short. And circle has no sides. They understand the attribute and they can feel the edges and the sides, and then they place that in the design that they are going to make. So that's kind of a fun activity, but at the same time, you review your attributes of shapes with the students so that they have a good concept of that. The other one of the areas of math that lends itself very well to functional IEP objective is measurement. And we use measurement in our lives daily, from clock to measuring the table, or measuring a tablecloth, or measuring an item of different types, or any one of those measurement things that, weighing yourself on the scale. These are all things that link to functional and personal life skills. So let's say the objective is, when presented with a clock and asked what the clock measures, the student will correctly identify the appropriate unit of measure. Is it length and breadth? Is it weight? Is it money that the clock measures? Or is it time? So the student makes that choice given an array of choices in 4 out of 5 opportunities over a 6-week period. And when I say 4 out of 5 opportunities, it is linked to a kind of a monitoring chart that you use. In that, you record the student's performance. When given tape measure and asked to measure, and these are all things that are kind of fun because it's a hands-on activity, asked to measure the perimeter of various items around the classroom. Let's say a book, the teacher desk, or the student desk, or the bulletin board, or a door, or that little opening in the door that's glass, maybe a cabinet, maybe a cafeteria table. Just for fun, you walk there. That makes the student to walk, so that gives a kind of a break, especially for your student with autism who needs that break. Will accurately you get them to measure, and you provide kind of 8 out of 10 items the student is able to correctly measure, and you give multiple opportunities, and you use a variety of tools so that adds to the excitement of measuring different items. And one of the things that I suggest is table ends, desks, you mark it with colored dots so that the student knows from where do we start and where do we end in our measurement. The other thing that I always recommend when I go visit classrooms is to kind of set up a pretend mock store in the classroom. So you don't have to begin with as many items that I have even shown. You can even begin with 3 items in your mock store in the beginning, and maybe they're all $1 or $2 and $3 to make it simple, and then add the complexity level with adding some items that are 50 cents, a quarter, or $2.50, and then that could be the next level of challenge. Or if you have students with multiple functioning levels, which most of us do in our classrooms, then you try and make it more complex for that student so that to challenge that student functioning at the high level. So when given dollar bills to purchase an item in the store with items costing from dollars to $5, I made sure I didn't put any decimals in there, and access to a limited number of items, especially when the students are just getting exposed to buying items and paying for the items, it's important to limit the number of items. It could be the classroom store that you set up, or it could be a school store, or it could be paying for lunch or something that they are buying at the school cafeteria. The student will exchange the money for a desired item with 100% accuracy. It is important to emphasize 100% accuracy because we make the task simpler so that the student will function at the highest possible correct response level, and you provide 8 to 10 opportunities, and you make sure you use a data probe to assess that. And it's extremely important for them to know the idea that $1 is less than $5. $1.50 is more than 50 cents. So it may even help to use real money, if at all possible, in the beginning stages at least, so that they can see and feel the concrete item. And the other support that is just as important as these concrete items and setting up kind of a mock store is the technology support that I already mentioned above. And definitely one of the things that's very helpful is using PowerPoint presentation. PowerPoint presentation with photographs that you have embedded within it will be helpful, and especially like the one that I mentioned about the student presence in the classroom. The same thing you can do about a pretend mock store that you're setting up, what you're going to do, what will be in the store, what will each item cost, let's say 4 slides that explain plus a title slide. The other thing that helps a lot is doing a lot of drama, pantomime, and role play. And that's where, again, going back to that mock store, you can have somebody as a cashier, somebody as a person who is walking into the store to buy, the buyer, the cashier, and they can role play their specific role that they are playing. And then present stories and blend in a dramatic element within it to make it more comprehensible. And there are these days a lot of apps that are available, but you have to be careful that the apps do not introduce greater complexity. And one of the simplest assistive technology tools that's available actually from AbleNet is this 2 surfaces in this device, which is called the iTalk2 communicator. They make a choice between yes or no, between $1 or is it $5? Is it yes or kind of maybe, or I need a break, I don't need a break. It can be as simple as that. Some of the other tools, and when the student has advanced from this 2 activation surfaces, you can use something like a quick talker, which has multiple icons and multiple pages that you can use. And then, of course, you can begin also with the big step-by-step, which has multiple levels. You can have sequenced set of directions. And then the talking brick communicator, you can attach it next to a word. When you have a vocabulary word wall in your classroom, next to each of those new vocabulary words that you are teaching, you can use one of these talking bricks programmed with that specific word and with a picture on the top. The other tool that is very helpful, especially for students who have motor issues, is to use an environmental control unit. And some of the other tools, this alternate spinner, it's not a voice output device, but it can be used for playing games or that kind of it's a spinner, so they can have fun identifying who will play, who will have the next turn in this particular game, who will have the turn to answer a question, that kind of a thing. Who will be the cashier, and you can put the pictures of the students there too, where the numbers are that you see. And the other one is the super talker. Again, that can be used in a group setting for students to respond to questions. It's extremely important that you plan ahead before you begin your assessment for your IEP. Make sure that you have all the data together. If you're working on writing that IEP, you have to make sure all of those scaffolds that you have used during your instruction is also used during assessment, and that based on those tools, these are the results that you have obtained, and use that as part of creating the new IEP. And it is important that you teach over and over again and practice it multiple times on those multiple opportunities before you do any assessment. Usually, the instructional tasks are usually at a higher complexity level, and your assessment is at a slightly lower complexity level. You want to teach to the maximum, and you kind of assess slightly at a lower level. And as I mentioned before, use all of the supports and adaptations. And so your delivery of instruction on a daily basis should include many of the scaffolds and supports that I mentioned. And as also make sure you use all of those during your assessment. So this is kind of your implementation plan. Are you using pictures, photographs? What assistive technology devices? For example, are you using any kind of special tools? Are you using stamps for the name? Are you using real money? So these are all things that you are considering ahead of time. What are some, are you going to, on a daily basis, are you going to have some peers mentoring and helping the students? And are you using tactile symbols in addition to your pictures? Are you using the AT device that's pre-programmed for that particular task? Your focus is always to make sure promoting the student's self-management skills, promoting the student for future work options. However limited they may be, you are always working towards maybe a possible potential vocational type of skill. And then you also want the student to have social relationships. So you are promoting those social communication skills. What are some activities that you can build in order to prepare the student for that future? Maybe the student can, on a regular basis, collect attendance from different classrooms and take it to the student. I know these days we try to do it on the computer. Maybe for a couple of classrooms, your student can do that. Maybe the student can go once a week or twice a week and shelve books in the library. Maybe the student can fill some containers, either in the art room or maybe in the cafeteria. So these are all things that we want to promote in that student towards a future work option. So you always ask yourself, what steps do I need to take in order to ensure successful student participation and response and promoting that independence? So, and then you're having this chart and make sure what that age or grade level of the student is, where you are going to try to implement. Is it going to be individualized? Is it going to be small group? Or is it going to be part of your whole classroom? Most of the students with significant disabilities are often, I find, in a self-contained setting, except for one or two classes that they may be participating in as part of a larger general education setting. one of the things that I would like to emphasize at this point is, as much as possible, if you are providing instruction for students with significant disabilities in a self-contained setting, and you have only about 6 to 8 students, try to do as much as possible small group setting so that you don't over-prompt that student by doing constantly one-on-one instruction. One-on-one, that kind of instruction may be when you are doing that data probes. But when you are providing that instruction, try to provide that instruction in that small group setting. And you can have a variety of learning objectives embedded into each of your lessons that lead towards your IEP objective. Again, we have a poll, and Samantha will improve her behavior 80% of the time with kind of exercise and easy to measure progress for data collection. This is an exercise that will. Is it precise and measurable, or is it hard to measure accurately? She will exercise self-control. That's kind of ultimately our goal. Is it easy to measure? Okay, I'm going to go skip to results. In a way, it's good that no one thought it's precise and measurable, because it's very difficult to measure behavior just 80% of the time. You want it 100% of the time, really, but that's your ultimate goal, but you have to be more precise every time you measure that particular, making sure that you are not setting up the student to something that's very difficult for that student to achieve. So you break it down into measurable elements so that it's easier to measure. Oh, it's still going on, and I talked too soon. Yes, it is hard to measure. You can look for measurable progress as much as possible by tweaking your objective so that you make sure it's set step by step, the student is reaching towards that ultimate goal. And next slide, I think, will show, yeah, it is showing a behavior objective. Let's first begin with what the student's present competencies are, and then help that student achieve that behavioral objective. Student is a 5th grader at an elementary school. She has significant cognitive and communication needs. Her strengths are she is able to use single words, and occasionally she will even use 2-word phrases to communicate her thoughts and ideas. But sometimes it may be difficult to understand that speech because it's sometimes unintelligible. And during instruction, one of the things that happens is she tends to be impulsive, and she doesn't give herself sufficient wait time, and kind of in an impulsive manner responds without reflecting. And she also does another thing. She will try to grab things from her peers seated next to her. She will grab their pencil, she will grab their worksheet, and she doesn't usually respond to redirection. So that's something you want to address immediately when she grabs, because it can scare her peers, and also the peer is not able to complete that activity if the student, someone else has grabbed her paper or pencil. So it's a behavior that you really want to completely eliminate. So what are some things that you can do? Given visual signals and cues presented silently to the student from the teacher or the paraeducator, the student will instead select an appropriate item to hold in her hand. In other words, you teach a replacement behavior to the student rather than grabbing the pencil or the paper or something else from her peer's desk, so that to avoid reaching and grabbing items, both in the classroom and in other locations, such as in the cafeteria, where she may grab the spoon or fork or something else from another student. She will do it 4 out of 5 reminders. Those are silent reminders. And she will try to do 4 out of 5 reminders, reaching towards an ultimate goal of 100% mastery. So the ultimate goal is 100%, but you begin with 4 out of 5 opportunities. She is able to demonstrate that skill. So some of the other things that you will provide that student is to kind of teach the student to think about and use personal space. So for that, you may have to label that area around the student's desk by marking that area with maybe masking tape, colored tape, and she is taught to keep her arms and hands within her space, designated personal space, and taking a photo of that and practicing that personal space on a one-on-one basis or using visual cues to remind her. And then some of the other things is prompting with visual signals. That's what I already mentioned. Some of the other things in addition that students will need is to use scripted stories. What happens, how others feel when you grab their items, what you need to do with your hands, and how to teach that. That's as a part of a social story, or it's really called social narratives, and teach that on a, again, one-on-one basis, and that particular scripted story is created for that student in order to prevent the student from engaging in the appropriate behavior. The other thing that is helpful is when the student feels very agitated and feels wants to grab and feeling stressed, anxiety, then the student requests a break, takes a 3-minute break or a 2-minute break, and returns back to her thing. So, and then one of the things, as the student makes progress in this, let's say in the beginning the student is only responding 1 out of 5 times to the visual, and you want to increase it to at least 4 times in the first 3 weeks or first 6 weeks, then you want to, after the student has made progress, you want the student to self-manage, and that thing is posted on her desk, the visual cue, and somebody points to that cue along with these kind of items that the student can squeeze or press. And then one of the most important things is to provide positive, I like the way you kept your hands to yourself. So, and then you can of course arrange other things, is peer partners who will read a story and will make that student feel a kind of relationship with the peer, and using technology and appropriate levels of cues and prompts, not over prompting, and then using calming techniques like music, and then some other things that I just mentioned about the squeezing stress balls. The next pole, using most to least prompting, in other words, fading that assistance gradually, will teach the student with significant disabilities. Most to least prompting. Is that an effective strategy, or is it an ineffective strategy? This is for a student with the most significant disabilities when you are teaching a new skill. The results are coming in. Okay, I'm going to skip to results. We see that most of you said it's an effective strategy. I totally agree with you. Yes, in the beginning stages of teaching a skill to a student with most significant disabilities, it's important to use most prompting, or it may almost, I hate to use the word intensive, but it is kind of intensive prompting that you use at the beginning stages. But I also can understand why people thought it's not an effective one, because when you use the terms most to least, it can, I understand, cause some concern, but in the beginning stages, you use that, and then you are making sure you are fading that prompting. For a student who is somewhat higher functioning, then you will begin with kind of least prompting if the student is able to verbally respond, and then if it's not working, then you may want to switch to most to least. So this is something that prompting, it has to be carefully monitored, and it is important for you to share that with your para-educator. The next one, another poll, providing the student wait time to respond after you have given a prompt, it will systematically fade and reduce the need for prompts. So is it wait time is good, or wait time will help, or wait time will hinder? So your response, I'm waiting, and you are working as hard. It looks like I may even go over the time a little bit. Awesome. This is fantastic and super, because often I thought a lot of the people that I observed were not providing the wait time. You are all wonderful. You emphasize through your response how critical it is to provide that wait time so that we are not coming with an answer too soon. That's fantastic. Okay, so, what did I do? I may have skipped. Okay, some of the social behavioral objectives, given at least 5 opportunities for social interaction with peers during homeroom, lunch, physical education, music, student will initiate communication by saying hello, and they can use a communication device, and we have to make sure it's done in different settings. And given opportunities to calm herself down, which is an example that I already shared with you using small sensory items, the student is reminded she will stay at her seat and will not wander around, and will stay and request a break if needed. All of that you can use as part of your objective. Personal living, let's say when the food tray is placed in front of a student, the student will reach and grasp the eating utensil 10 different times during 5 consecutive days during breakfast and lunch periods in the cafeteria. The reason why I had this objective, sometimes we find that it is a lot easier to feed the student rather than wait for the student to feed himself or herself. So it is important for us to provide that wait time and encourage the student to eat. Provided with an array of 6 to 8 picture choices to select from, this is for a slightly higher functioning student, the student will make healthy food choices. So this is where you are moving to that early symbolic or expanded symbolic level. These are some motor supports that you can use. You can, your OT may be able to provide you with greater guidance, but this is something that's a headliner cloth that you see. You just use Velcro and you use the headliner cloth and you can insert objects. This will help the student to be more independent instead of holding the student's hand and moving the student's hand. So the student feels empowered. These are all variety of things where either the glove is attached or that headliner cloth is attached with Velcro, and the student, and you insert objects for the student to be able to manipulate the object himself or herself. Another one is a little paper clip there. That's a page turner, and you can use that foam material, packaging foam material attached to the paper clip so that the student can turn. You can also use a craft stick, but sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to use the craft stick. So that will provide the student the opportunity to turn the page himself or herself. The other thing I want to mention here is the Dyson mat, or you can use any kind of shelf liner that has a sticky surface to provide a non-slip work surface for the student. Instead of trying to hold the mat down, the student can operate the object on the mat. This is the data sheet that I was talking about earlier, where you are doing the data probes. You're working on a specific objective, you write down that objective, and the communication opportunity, the response opportunity is written down for each response. You indicate how the student responded correctly or incorrectly, and also the level of prompt that you used. It's important for you to note down that prompt. If it is always verbal prompt or physical prompt, that means the student is not able to do that task independently. Then you have to make sure that you are lowering your complexity level so that you are not repeating that same objective over and over again. And what kind of adapted materials you are using, the same that you use during instruction is used during this data probe, and then later on used during your assessment of IEP. So ask yourself, are you addressing the student's unique needs? Is it specific and measurable? Are you including the evaluation measurement? Are you using an evaluation schedule? Are you, most important, are you providing for learners' active participation? I have a number of resources included in this, and as I mentioned, most of this material comes from 2 of my books, but there are some other resources that you will find helpful as well. And I want to thank each and every one of you. I'm sorry I'm exceeded the time limit by a few minutes. And the next webinar is next Wednesday. That will focus on executive function working memory. And then I am doing another webinar for AbleNet University on mindfulness, yoga, and breathing practices. That's on November 29th. I am also doing for a company in Austin, Texas called Ed 311, a para-educator webinar series. It's a 21 hours of training spread over a 6-month period, and the first session, which is on November 14th, is offered free of cost. It's an extensive, comprehensive training for para-educators so that they can provide the necessary supportive role. Thank you very much, and most importantly, I want to thank AbleNet University for hosting this webinar. Thank you all for attending the webinar, and thank you, AbleNet.